My daughter-in-law burst into tears before I said a single word, and somehow every face in the room turned toward me as if I had already been found guilty. I hadn't raised my voice. I hadn't made an accusation. Yet her trembling hands seemed to answer questions no one had even asked. Then she whispered something so softly that only the people closest to her could hear it, and whatever they heard changed the way they looked at me forever. My own son stepped between us without asking what had happened. That was the exact moment I realized I wasn't walking into a family disagreement. I was walking into a story that had already been written, and I had been cast as the villain before I ever arrived. I wish I could tell you that I fought back right then. I didn't. I simply watched. Because there was something about those tears that felt rehearsed, almost too perfect, appearing at exactly the right second, disappearing whenever no one was looking. My name is Margaret Dawson. I was 68 years old when I finally understood that some people don't need to shout to control a room. They only need everyone to believe the first version of the story. Until that afternoon, I believed honesty would always speak louder than performance. I was about to learn how wrong I had been. For years, I blamed myself for the growing distance between Ethan and me. I told myself that every family changed after a marriage, that young couples needed space, and that perhaps I simply had to learn a new place in my son's life. Vanessa always knew exactly what to say in public. She remembered birthdays, brought homemade desserts to neighborhood gatherings, and never forgot to ask people about their families. Everyone admired her kindness. I admired it too. Looking back now, I realize I spent more time defending her than questioning the quiet discomfort I carried home after every visit. There were little moments that never seemed important on their own. Ethan stopped calling without her sitting beside him. Family dinners ended earlier than they used to. Conversations suddenly became awkward whenever I entered the room. If I offered advice, Vanessa smiled politely before changing the subject. If I shared a memory, she somehow found a reason to make herself the center of the conversation. None of it felt serious enough to confront. None of it seemed worth risking peace over. That is the dangerous thing about careful manipulation. It rarely arrives like a thunderstorm. It settles into everyday life, one polite smile, one misunderstood conversation, and one carefully timed tear at a time until everyone forgets what normal used to look like, including the person living through it. The first crack appeared where no one else was looking. 2 weeks before that family gathering, I stopped by Ethan and Vanessa's house with a pot of homemade chicken soup, because Ethan had mentioned he was feeling under the weather. I rang the doorbell, but before anyone answered, I heard laughter through the living room window. It was warm, carefree laughter, the kind that disappears the moment a door opens. Vanessa answered with red eyes and a shaky voice, apologizing for keeping me waiting because she had supposedly been crying all afternoon over stress at work. Yet only seconds earlier, she had sounded happier than I had heard her in months. I told myself I must have misunderstood. A few days later, she repeated the same performance during Sunday dinner. The instant Ethan questioned a charge on their credit card, her eyes filled with tears, her voice trembled, and the conversation immediately shifted from missing money to comforting her. Ethan apologized before she even explained herself. That pattern repeated again and again. Every difficult question somehow ended with someone reassuring Vanessa instead of asking for answers. I began noticing something else as well. Whenever she believed nobody was watching, the tears stopped almost instantly. Her expression became calm, focused, almost calculating, as though she had simply finished another successful conversation. For the first time, I wondered whether I had been witnessing emotion at all, or something much more deliberate. 3 days after I admitted my doubts to myself, my oldest friend, Linda Cooper, invited me to lunch at a quiet cafe we had visited for years. She stirred her coffee for a long time before saying a single word. I could tell she was choosing each sentence carefully because she knew whatever came next might change the way I looked at my own family forever. Finally, she lowered her voice and asked, "Margaret, has Vanessa always cried that easily?" The question caught me off guard. I hesitated before answering that I thought she was simply sensitive. Linda slowly shook her head. She told me she had once walked into the ladies' room at a charity fundraiser and found Vanessa standing in front of the mirror. There were no tears on her face then. Instead, she was practicing expressions, taking slow breaths, touching the corners of her eyes, and whispering different versions of the same sentence until her voice sounded fragile enough to earn sympathy. Linda had assumed Vanessa was rehearsing for community theater, until she stepped into the ballroom 5 minutes later and watched the exact performance unfold in front of dozens of guests. Linda never mentioned it because she believed it was an isolated moment. As she finished her story, I felt every uneasy memory from the past few years begin fitting together like pieces of a puzzle that I had been too trusting to solve. From that day forward, I stopped trying to convince anyone that I was right. Instead, I became the quiet observer everyone overlooked. I bought a small notebook that fit inside my purse, and after every family gathering, I wrote down exactly what had happened while the details were still fresh in my mind. I recorded the questions that were never answered, the conversations that suddenly changed direction whenever Vanessa became emotional, and the remarkable way Ethan always abandoned his own concerns the moment she began to cry. I was not collecting evidence against her. I was collecting clarity for myself because I no longer trusted my own memory after years of subtle manipulation. The more I watched, the more predictable everything became. Whenever someone challenged Vanessa, even politely, she reached for her emotions before she reached for an explanation. Whenever the attention returned to facts, another personal story appeared to redirect the room. I also noticed something even more revealing. She frequently glanced at the people around her before reacting, almost as if she needed to measure whether the audience was paying attention. Real feelings rarely wait for permission. Performances usually do. I never interrupted. I never argued. I simply let every conversation unfold naturally, believing that the truth often reveals itself when nobody realizes they are slowly exposing it. The next family gathering arrived sooner than I expected. It was my granddaughter's birthday, and everyone crowded into Ethan and Vanessa's backyard with wrapped presents, paper plates, and easy smiles that looked genuine from a distance. I promised myself I would not test anyone. I would simply watch. For nearly an hour, everything seemed ordinary. Then Ethan mentioned that he had been thinking about helping me with a few repairs around my house the following weekend. Before I could answer, I noticed Vanessa's expression change for only a fraction of a second. She smiled, but it never reached her eyes. Moments later, she quietly excused herself. When she returned, her voice was softer, and she apologized for feeling overwhelmed because she feared everyone expected too much from Ethan. Within seconds, the conversation shifted away from my home and toward reassuring her that she did not need to worry about anything. Ethan immediately withdrew his offer without realizing he had done it. Nobody questioned how the subject had changed so completely. Nobody except me. I looked around the table and realized every person sincerely believed they had witnessed a spontaneous emotional moment. I had witnessed a pattern. For the first time, I understood that exposing the truth would require patience, because people rarely abandon a comforting illusion until they discover it with their own eyes. 2 days later, something happened that I could not ignore. Ethan called and asked whether I had mentioned to anyone that he and Vanessa were struggling financially. I told him I had never discussed their private life with anyone because it was not my story to tell. There was a long silence before he admitted that Vanessa believed I had embarrassed them in front of relatives. The accusation made no sense, yet I recognized the pattern immediately. There was no specific conversation, no witness, and no evidence. There was only a feeling that somehow became accepted as truth. Instead of defending myself, I simply asked Ethan one question. Did anyone actually hear me say those words? He hesitated. Then he quietly answered, no. It was the first time I heard uncertainty in his voice. That tiny pause gave me hope because certainty had always been Vanessa's greatest advantage. Later that evening, Linda called again. She had spoken with another woman from the charity committee who remembered the fundraiser differently. She recalled seeing Vanessa leave the ballroom completely composed, only to return moments later looking heartbroken after noticing several guests watching her. Neither woman wanted to accuse anyone unfairly, but their memories matched too closely to dismiss. For the first time, I realized I was no longer carrying these doubts alone, and the story everyone believed had begun to develop its first visible cracks. The opportunity arrived when nobody expected it. Ethan invited the family to Sunday dinner because he wanted everyone together before leaving on a short business trip the following week. I accepted without mentioning a single one of my suspicions. I had learned that facts carried more weight when people discovered them on their own. During dinner, Vanessa excused herself after receiving a phone call. She stepped onto the back patio, leaving her phone on the kitchen counter. It began buzzing again only moments later. Ethan glanced at the screen intending to silence it, but a preview of the newest message appeared before him. It was from someone named Melissa. The words were brief, yet impossible to misunderstand. "You should teach me how you cry on command. Nobody questions you." Ethan froze. He did not say a word. He simply stared at the screen as though he hoped the message would disappear if he looked away long enough. I watched his expression change from confusion to disbelief. When Vanessa returned, she noticed the silence before anyone spoke. Her eyes immediately filled with tears, almost by instinct, but this time something was different. Ethan did not rush to comfort her. He quietly picked up the phone, looked directly at her, and asked one calm question. "What exactly does this message mean?" For the first time since all of this began, she had no immediate answer. The room remained silent for what felt like an entire minute. Vanessa looked from Ethan to me, searching for the familiar expressions of sympathy that had always rescued her before. They never came. She laughed softly and claimed the message was nothing more than a joke between friends, insisting Melissa had exaggerated a private conversation. Ethan did not argue. He simply asked to see the rest of the messages. That quiet request carried more weight than any accusation ever could. Vanessa hesitated just long enough for everyone at the table to notice. In all the years I had known her, hesitation had never been part of her performance. She reached for the phone, but Ethan calmly held it where it was. Nobody interrupted him. Nobody rushed to comfort her. The balance inside that room had shifted without anyone raising a voice. I watched my son with a mixture of sadness and relief, because I could finally see him asking questions instead of accepting emotions as answers. Vanessa's eyes filled once again. Yet this time the tears changed nothing. They no longer redirected the conversation. They no longer erased the facts sitting plainly in front of everyone. I realized then that the truth rarely arrives with dramatic speeches or perfect justice. Sometimes it begins with a single unanswered question, followed by the silence of people who are finally willing to hear the answer.